Netanyahu goes to Mar-a-Lago on December 29th, and he's begging Trump to bomb Iran. Specifically, what is he saying? He's begging Trump to bomb their missiles. So we took out the nukes, check. Now Netanyahu is worried about their other deterrent, their ballistic missiles. Because, of course, Israel cannot topple their government without Iran lobbing 1,000 missiles at Israel every single day for a week. So Israel has to take out now the missiles. So he goes to Trump and begs him, can we get the green light for a second wave of strikes? Coincidentally, a week later, one of Iran's state-sponsored banks collapses and there are massive protests. And as we talked about, these are not organic protests. This is a color revolution. Eyewitnesses, according to the Financial Times, said they saw men dressed in all black, armed with automatic rifles, storming government buildings. These are Israel and CIA-backed proxies, probably Kurdish in origin, if I had to guess, other separatists, other types of operatives. But then you have this color revolution, you have this insurrection backed by Israel and the CIA. Trump goes on Twitter and says help is on the way. He's preparing to strike Iran a second time, and this time attacking their internal security service and their missiles. At the last minute, he calls off the strike. Why? Because at this point in time, we had just kidnapped Maduro. And so all of our forces are either in the Pacific or in the Caribbean. We only had a handful of ships in the Middle East. What does that mean? It means we're missing an air force. We're missing key radar and early warning systems.
Well, it just shows you how far and thin that the U.S. spreads its military forces across the world to try to do everything in every single region in the name of empire building. That's what they try to do. I'm generally with Nick when he talks about these protests not being organic. That's not to say that there were no genuine Iranian protesters protesting the drought or the financial conditions. It's that it was inspired by the CIA, by Mossad, who encouraged it, much like they did in Maidan. And then you had Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, going to Davos and boasting to those globalist thugs, hey, we're categorically tanking the Iranian economy because of our sanctions regime. We're forcing their hand in a way and getting their central bank to print more currency, inflate it like the Federal Reserve does, just to a more extreme degree, and destroy that economy. So yeah, that encourages those protests, but they're also backed by CIA and Mossad agents embedded in those crowds. They wanted to have a color revolution, clearly.
We don't have a ton of personnel. And so if we strike Iran during the protests and it doesn't topple the regime, then they get to lob 100 missiles at Israel and missiles at U.S. bases without a warning, and we will not be able to sufficiently protect those targets. And that means that Israel's getting pounded. That means that U.S. bases in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Damascus, in Jordan, in Al Udeid, they're all being bombed, or they could all be potential targets. And so, at the last minute, Trump pulls back the strike and says, we need to wait to have more power in the region. We need to evacuate certain personnel. We need to get ready. And that's exactly what he did.
Yeah, they've sent the USS Abraham Lincoln into the region. Netanyahu actually does want the Iranians to strike U.S. forces because that would pull the U.S. in. It would inspire a new propaganda campaign by the CIA, by the deep state, to go in full bore, potentially with a regime change. He doesn't want those missiles lobbed at him. He doesn't want the cruise and ballistic missiles from Iran hitting Israel, and that is why there are news sources and indications that it was Israel that said, don't strike Iran yet, get your resources in there. But Netanyahu actually probably doesn't want the U.S. to strike unless they're committed to arming rebel groups, going in with special forces, or doing what it takes for regime change, because they're going to feel probably the brunt of the missile counterattacks. Now, he wants those counterattacks hitting Americans. Believe it or not, it's not too hard to believe if you follow this stuff to draw the Americans in. But if he doesn't get that, Israel's just going to get pelted.
So he diverted the USS Abraham Lincoln from the Pacific to the Middle East. He sent in a number of refueling aircraft, military transport aircraft, all kinds of strike aircraft, fighter jets, moving THAAD systems, moving anti-missile systems into the region, deploying tens of thousands of personnel, evacuating other personnel in preparation for a protracted wave of attacks against Iran. So we have another aircraft carrier there. We have all these fighter jets, strike aircraft. Everything's all ready to go. And these are our demands. We're telling Iran, you cannot enrich uranium. You have to give up your stockpile of enriched uranium. We are telling them you have to limit the number and range of your ballistic missiles such that they cannot hit Israel. And you have to abandon all your support for every regional group in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's just a deal that they can never accept. Not having a nuclear energy program whatsoever. That wasn't on the table, of course, during the original negotiations until the tail end, when Trump and Netanyahu clearly colluded to just bomb them rather than to come up with a new JCPOA-like deal to constrain the nuclear enrichment program of Iran like it was from 2015 to 2018 that Netanyahu encouraged Trump to shred, to take off the table, the idea that we'd have peaceable relations with Iran. That's the last thing Israel wants of Iran and the United States. No, they wanted that shredded, excuse my voice, so that they could put regime change back on the table. And there it's been since 2018. They had their talons sank deep within Trump, but there's no way that they'll agree to curtail that and decide, no, we'll have no deterrent against Israel with our ballistic missiles. We won't have ballistic missiles at all. It makes them sitting ducks. It makes them defenseless. And we know that Israel has a history of striking them first in a war of choice, just like they did last summer. It's never going to be accepted, so this is just kind of demands that can never be entertained by Iran, which basically guarantees war if Trump does follow through.
Now, think about this from Iran's perspective. Israel wants you dead. We, the United States and Israel, have been openly talking about regime change for years. For years. Saying we want to topple their government. We want to reinstall the monarchy, the Shah. Iran's only means of defending itself is its nuclear hedge, its ballistic missiles, which can hit Israel, and its proxies.
One correction, there is no nuclear hedge unless you buy into the propaganda of neocons that think they had a nuke back in 1998, 1996, and have been warning about that since. Even if you listen to Tulsi Gabbard last year in March, in her annual threat summary, she dispelled those rumors. And then, of course, they came back up to inspire war propaganda on the eve of the U.S. bombing. Oh, we're privy to intelligence that they're weeks away from a nuke. No, that's buying into the propaganda. They had nuclear enrichment, obviously, for their nuclear energy program, but no indication that they ever had the nuke.
And we're telling them, if you don't make yourself absolutely defenseless, then we will destroy you. Well, Iran must realize that they will be destroyed regardless. If they give up their centrifuges, their enriched uranium, if they give up their missiles, if they give up their proxies, they are defenseless. They are vulnerable. If they don't have missiles that can hit Israel, then that means Israel can bomb them with impunity. Iran does not have adequate air defense. Iran does not have air superiority. If they don't have the missiles, Israel will control the skies, and that means they can just hit Iran whenever they want, however much they want. Without the proxies, Israel does not have to worry about anything on their border, not on the north with Hezbollah, the south with Hamas, the east with the Popular Mobilization Force. And without a nuke, you can topple the Iranian government and not have any concern about what happens next.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I think what happens next is consequential, as we've seen in both Afghanistan and Iraq for U.S. forces in the region, certainly so. If you don't have an occupying force, it's less of a concern. But that has serious ramifications for the United States if it goes head in here, though I am with Nick that this is kind of a lose-lose from Iran's perspective, and the bigger lose of those two loses would be giving up their only deterrent against Israel and the United States attacks. They're not going to give up their nuclear enrichment and ballistic missiles. How could they? That would guarantee that the regime change would just be easier.
Okay, so Iran becomes a failed state. So it balkanizes. So it turns into violent chaos and disorder that lasts decades. Well, as long as they don't have a nuke, not really our problem. So the logic goes. So our demands are that they make themselves defenseless. They will never agree to that. They will take their chances on the battlefield. Because if they don't, well, then now you're really screwed. Now you're up a creek without a paddle. So we're telling them either you give up everything, you render yourself completely vulnerable, or else we go in. Well, what do you think is going to happen here? Iran doesn't trust us. Iran has so far refused to negotiate. Iran will never agree to these terms. And by the way, even if they began to negotiate, once again, I will remind you, there is a third party here that is extremely active. And that third party, Israel, just as they did last year, just as they did in 2024, they will sabotage the diplomacy. So this is what I'm talking about. Ostensibly, we are there doing gunboat diplomacy. Give us what we want or else. Well, that relationship is already impossibly frayed. It is damaged beyond repair. It is irreparably harmed.
Yeah, how couldn't it be after the U.S. literally sabotaged diplomatic efforts and in different phases of the negotiations with Iran just to collude with Netanyahu to bomb Iran and take off the table what Trump had openly said was my foreign policy decision, and that is a peaceable agreement with Iran? How could you trust the United States after all the neocons have talked for years and decades, in fact, about regime change in Iran? How the Likudniks and the Israelis have talked about regime change. If I was an Iranian, I've said this in other videos, especially back in the summer if you watch them. If I'm an Iranian nationalist advising the Ayatollah and the leadership of the Iranian regime, I'd say fast track a nuke now, because that's what North Korea did. They acquired a nuke, and then regime change isn't on the table whatsoever with North Korea. It's not like Israel wanted that, but no one even entertains the prospect of regime change with nuclear powers. So that would be the ultimate hedge against the United States and Israel. That's what I would do if I was Iran. How could you not? So the U.S. has really done, despite all of its propaganda, everything it possibly can to encourage Iran to get a nuclear weapon.
But even if it worked, even if what Trump was doing could or did work, the Israelis have the final say. They have the ace up their sleeve because they could always sabotage it. So there is such a low likelihood, based on those years of distrust between the leaders of America, the current leaders of America and Iran, based on the years of hostilities, sabotage, subterfuge, openly hostile rhetoric. Even if you could overcome it, Israel would still sabotage it with a false flag, with some sort of provocation, with their rhetoric, lobbying. They would find a way to derail it. And that means you think you have a few options. Realistically, you have two. In the end, you have exactly one. They have narrowed the range of options to one course. It is a slit. It is not a double slit experiment. You have one hallway, one door that you can walk through, and that's a war with Iran.
Yeah, I hate to say that I largely agree with this. The sabotage prospect is compelling, and we've seen that time and time again. Why is the U.S. even here? Because they sabotage the U.S. propaganda game to try to get away from this thing, with Trump saying, hey, we set their nuclear weapons program back decades, their nuclear enrichment back decades back in the 12-Day War. And I was saying, hey, I actually am glad. I don't believe that, but I'm glad that that's the propaganda coming out of the White House right now, because that could get the United States possibly away from this. But now we're right back in it. It's all a manufactured plot by the Mossad, by the CIA, by the neocons like Rubio in Trump's cabinet, and Netanyahu and his goons wanting this for their entire political careers, that we're back here. So yeah, it does seem like this is going to happen, whether we like it or not. It could even inspire Israel to go totally desperate and get into a false flag attack to draw the U.S. in. They are not alien to false flag attacks. Look at the Levant affair if you're not sure about that. Look about other circumstances like the King David Hotel bombing when you had Jewish terrorists under Irgun, Menachem Begin's organization, dress like Palestinians and claim it was Palestinians at first and then eventually take blame. So the Israelis are no alien to false flag operations, especially that would give them the crown jewel of their foreign policy ambitions for decades, and that would be Iranian regime change on the backs of the U.S. taxpayers and military, of course.
That's where we are. And it has to happen quickly. Because what they are telling the United States is that Iran is racing towards a primitive nuclear warhead. It's a matter of time. What they are telling the United States is they are racing towards a newly built ballistic missile arsenal. Israel says that Iran has fully reconstituted its missile program to the same level as it had before Israel went to war with Iran last June. And to top it all off, Netanyahu is making his 6th visit to the White House in February.
Oh, great. So America's real president's going back to the White House. I wonder if he'll invite Trump at some point to discuss what policy the United States foreign policy apparatus will be operating under. Great. Yeah, that's more White House visits than Trump, I think, at this point, right?
Which is in 2 days. Okay? This is where we are. So I think it is inevitable, it is a certainty that we are going to war with Iran quickly. And they got Trump locked in for 4 years. And it doesn't stop here, even if this one is another one and done. The long-term goal is to topple the Iranian government. This is a terminal regime. It's over. Their proxies are defeated. As a regional power, they are neutralized. Their strategic weapons have been degraded. There is civil unrest. The economy is a failure.
Well, yeah, I agree that's the end game. I don't think it's over unless the U.S. does aid rebels or put boots on the ground there. Clearly, the Israeli military isn't going to put boots on the ground. They use the United States to do that. In many ways, we're their proxy. They're not our proxy. They get every advantage out of our subsidies and military intelligence and funding for their genocidal regime while they sit back and work on the Greater Israel Project, work on their genocide in Gaza, in West Bank exploitation and expansion of settlements. The Iranian regime isn't over, and there's no indication that just bombing will ever do that. It's just that the Israelis are banking on the U.S. going in more through an escalation, whether it is a counterattack that kills U.S. forces or a false flag. It's definitely not over yet, though.
And so the United States and Israel are going to once again degrade Iran's defenses. And maybe this will just be the second one. They're going to attack the Internal Security Service so that Iran is vulnerable to infiltration. They're going to attack Iran's missiles so that Iran cannot strike Israel preemptively or otherwise. They are going to finish off the nuclear hedge. And then Iran will be like a lame duck country waiting to be toppled by a color revolution and assisted by the United States. And Israel knows they got 2 more years with this guy, 2 more years to make it happen. That's what we got set up for. And it was like that from the beginning.
Okay, I generally agree, but some parts I disagree. They're not going to finish off a nuclear hedge that doesn't exist. Again, that's buying into the propaganda that they have nukes, and we were told that they were set back decades. Now, even before that propaganda, you know, a lot of us were like, well, there's no evidence. Even Netanyahu would not say until like 2 days after the bombing started that we think they're a year away from a nuclear weapon. And that was before the U.S. used these high-tech bunker buster bombs to destroy their centrifuges, going deep down, penetrating into the ground to do that in 3 facilities, including Fordo. Now, there were some indications that satellites had captured motorcades going into Fordo and possibly getting out the enriched uranium before that happened. But at the same time, the nuclear threat has been trumped up by Netanyahu, by the neocons, by the Zionists that have always wanted this regime change operation as much, if not more, than they wanted regime change operations in Syria and Libya and Somalia and Iraq, all carried out by U.S. military might, empire building schemes, etc., and where military contractors prospered through it, with Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Raytheon being the primary beneficiaries of this centrally planned policy that wouldn't elevate companies such as this in times when the United States government doesn't just drop bombs indiscriminately and remove all of Israel's enemies, even to the extent that they elevate Al-Qaeda in the process like they did in Syria. So I don't think this is over. Iran's regime is not over. There's no sense that I have that just bombings will cause regime change. And Israel doesn't want that level of commitment from the United States. They want more of a commitment, arming rebel groups, special forces on the ground, boots on the ground if they can get it. And I do think that there's a divide in Trump's cabinet with some people like Rubio wanting to do that. He's the most important. He's both the Secretary of State and the Homeland Security Advisor. He probably has the most power of anyone in this government right now. But some of them probably don't. Tulsi Gabbard's been compromised or silent, but her inclinations were not on the side of regime change prior to her going into the White House. But again, she's been silent, compromised. We know she's been compromised on this issue because the day before U.S. bombing in Iran back in the summer, she said, oh, we've suddenly become privy to intelligence that Iran's weeks away from acquiring a nuke, completely countering what she had said 9 weeks earlier in her annual threat summary. So that's what we have here. It's hard for me to believe that there'll be no military strike, but it really depends on the commitment of U.S. resources and forces on the ground in Iran that will tell whether a regime change will be successful. It's what Netanyahu wants. He just doesn't want to take the reprisal attacks from missiles in Iran. I say too bad, because look, Iran is no threat to the United States. It's never been. It's all been a propaganda campaign to assure us of that, with Netanyahu going on to Ben Shapiro's podcast back in October and saying, hey, there'll be a mushroom cloud above Boston and New York City soon. It's so absurd. They have no delivery mechanism for that, even if they had nukes, which they don't. And the ultimate hypocrisy, the ultimate irony here is that Israel is the only country in that region, in the Middle East, that does have a secret nuclear weapons program, but they're hypocritically waging war on other countries like Iran on the auspices that it has a secret nuclear weapons program. It's so absurd, roping the U.S. and my country into this while Americans languish under debt and inflation and culture war playing out in the United States. You have the ICE raids, all sorts of things that Americans want more focus on internally. Doesn't matter. You get people like Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz. All they talk about on Twitter is anything but what their constituents want. They only talk about foreign wars. How can we fund Zelensky and Netanyahu more? How can we arrest or kidnap, I should say, foreign leaders and enact regime change in Venezuela? Or how can we get what we want? There's no telling that Delcy Rodriguez is going to play ball under a Chauvinista regime that rejected U.S. imperialism, or that if she does, that won't cause internal strife, potential civil war. No indication whatsoever. So you have all these absurd U.S. foreign policy, conquests that are taking place while Americans are languishing. That's the most criminal thing. I largely think Nick is right, but I think he's overplaying the nuclear threat, which I don't think exists. And while Iran has every incentive in the book for it to exist so that they don't have to suffer, all this regime change propaganda like North Korea doesn't, there's no indication that they have nuclear warheads. There's just not. That's part of the propaganda scheme, but that's where we're at right now.